All right, lovely ladies and gents. We've been talking about ancient Egypt and ancient Egypt's pharaohs. We are going over standard 6.20, which talks about distinguishing between the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms and the 6 pharaohs that we're about to go over, and those 6 pharaohs' contributions. First pharaoh I want you to document is Menes/Narmer. They're considered to be the same person. Oop, this is not the right video. Let me back that up. Let's see. Where's Menes? That's more Khufu. Here we go. Here's your video on Menes before I give you your notes to take.
Menes, meaning he who endures, was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh believed to be the first man to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, and was the founder of the first dynasty of Egypt. Almost no archaeological records of Menes exist, but a great deal of information exists on the historical figure known as Narmer, who is also credited with uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, which leads some historians to believe that they are the same person. In Egyptian legend, he was believed to be the first human ruler of Egypt. The previous rulers were all believed to be gods, after he inherited the crown of Egypt directly from the god Horus. He became the king of Egypt in around 3000 BC. Menes is said to have introduced the practice of worship of the gods to Egypt, as well as encouraging Egyptian society to flourish by introducing greater sophistication, elegance, and luxury. His capital city is said to be Thuris in ancient Egypt, and it was here that he died and was buried after he was attacked by a crocodile while swimming.
All right. So, Menes, I'm going to give you a little pro tip. I would pause this video, write down all of your notes, and then come back to this video and finish listening, because I'm just going to talk right through it. Menes and Narmer are considered to be the same person by historians, so I'd make note of that in your notes. His rule started about 3000 BC. He's considered the first pharaoh of the first dynasty, and he's believed to have inherited the kingship directly from the god Horus. There's a couple different conflicting historical views on who Horus is. He's either considered the son of Osiris and Isis, or he's the oldest god. Both are conflicting views held by historians. All right, back to Menes. Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt into like one Egypt nation. He wore a double crown to symbolize this unification. The lower part of his crown was red, the upper part was white. Menes is the first pharaoh, meaning the first god king. Miss Anderson and Miss Wills have both told you, as well as I've told you, the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the embodiment of the gods. Okay, so if you remember, the Mesopotamians believed that their leader was the pathway to the gods. The pharaohs believed, or the Egyptians believed, that their pharaoh was a god. So much like Christians believe that Jesus is God in flesh, Egyptians believe the same thing about their pharaoh. Menes founded Memphis as his capital city. He was buried in a modest tomb. And when I say modest, I mean modest by Pharaoh standards, not modest by our standards. He also developed trade with Canaan and other nearby regions. So, pretty good for a first pharaoh there. All right, our next pharaoh is Khufu, and I have 2 videos on Khufu. Okay, the first is going to talk about his Great Pyramid in Giza that you've probably seen and heard of before.
Pyramid of Khufu is the oldest and largest of the 3 pyramids in Giza, on the outskirts of Cairo in Egypt. It is believed the pyramid was built as a tomb for 4th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh Khufu and was constructed over a 20-year period. The pyramid remained the tallest man-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years, unsurpassed until the spire of Lincoln Cathedral was completed in the 14th century. The Great Pyramid consists of an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks. There have been varying scientific and alternative theories about the Great Pyramid's construction techniques. It is estimated that completing the building in 20 years would involve moving an average of more than one block into its place every 5 minutes, day and night. At completion, the Great Pyramid was covered by white casing stones that formed a smooth outer surface. What is seen today is the underlying core structure. Some of the casing stones that once covered the pyramid can still be seen around the base. The casing stones were fit together with extremely high precision. The mean opening of the joints was only ½ millimeter wide. The accuracy of the pyramid's workmanship is such that the 4 sides of the base have an average error of only 58 millimeters in length. The base is horizontal and flat to within 15 millimeters.
Guys, I just want to take a moment to note how impressive this is. They were building this by hand, okay? They didn't have cranes and machines like we have today and dump trucks. These were just people building the pyramids with like ramps and pulleys. So, incredibly impressive.
There are 3 known chambers inside the Great Pyramid. The so-called Queen's and King's chambers are higher up within the structure. The lowest chamber, which was never finished, is cut into the bedrock upon which the pyramid was built. Today, tourists enter the Great Pyramid via the Robbers Tunnel, dug by workmen employed by Pharaoh around year 820. The Queen's chamber is accessed via steep and very narrow ascending passage. At the upper end, the passage joins the Grand Gallery, which is 8.6 meters high and over 46 meters long, and slopes upwards, leading to the King's chamber. The only object in the King's chamber is a rectangular granite sarcophagus, which is roughly finished and has a broken corner.
Alright, so that's our first video on Khufu. The second one is going to highlight Khufu's ship, his boat for the afterlife.
Over 4,500 years ago, the Pharaoh Khufu ordered the construction of the Great Pyramid. What he buried beneath it is, in its own way, every bit as impressive.
The amazing thing about this discovery, it is how the Egyptians, 4,600 years ago, constructed this incredible boat.
The Khufu ship is the most extraordinary artifact in the world. 13 stories tall, if you stand it on its end, 1,200 parts, and held together with little pieces of wood and a kind of sewing.
The site at Giza had been excavated many times. But this find was made by chance.
The discovery happened by accident completely. Many of the major discoveries always come with luck.
It was 1952. Archaeologist Kamel El-Malak was supervising the clear-up of an area right by the Great Pyramid.
This south of the pyramid was completely covered with debris and stone rubble. Then they began to clean the stone rubble.
As they were clearing, they found these large slabs of limestone that were very carefully laid.
Curious, El-Malak bored a small hole through one of them.
When this man came and looked inside, he said to me, I did smell history.
He discovered 41 huge limestone blocks, weighing between 17 and 20 tons. They covered a deep pit over 100 feet long. But it was the contents of the pit that excited Egyptologists.
It was this huge pile of wood and rope and oars, which gave the game away.
Why would Khufu bury a ship in the desert beside his pyramid? The answer tells us how the Egyptians saw death and what the pharaoh believed would happen to him. The pyramid would hold his mortal remains, but his soul would leave. It would be transformed.
Khufu was a king and a god, so when he died, he became one with the sun god.
Ascending to the heavens, the pharaoh would become one with the sun god Ra. Unified, they would make the sun's daily journey across the sky. They would be carried, the Egyptians believed, in a great boat.
The idea of doing that made perfect sense to the Egyptians because they saw the path of the boat as being not flying through the sky, but rather traveling on the rivers that surrounded their whole entire world.
In Egyptian thinking, this boat had a clear, practical purpose. It would be used in the afterlife. The Khufu boat was intended to carry its master through the heavens. It played a vital religious role, and this is a sign of something else. The fact that boats and water were central to Egyptian life.
The Khufu boat is a fabulous testament to the importance of the Nile to the ancient Egyptians.
Boats meant the Nile, and the Nile was Egypt.
Egyptians relied on the Nile for food, for water, for irrigation, but most of all they relied on the Nile to move them from place to place.
The Nile linked the north and south of Egypt. The Egyptians traded with the outside world via the Nile. It was the wealth the river brought that caused their civilization to grow.
The Nile was the most important thing for the Egyptians to make this civilization. And that's why we can say that with the Egyptian, the Nile built ancient Egypt.
Treasure, gold and jewels came from Nubia in the far south. The hard granite which built Egypt's finest monuments traveled hundreds of miles by river from Aswan. Pharaohs sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt, 1,000 miles to the south. Boat-based trade bore vast resources into the country and allowed the pharaohs of Egypt to build an empire. The importance of boats to ancient Egyptians is clear from wall art all across the country. But artwork cannot reveal the ingenious techniques they used to build such massive vessels. For archaeologists, the discovery of this real boat, perfectly preserved by the manner of its burial, is like a time capsule.
It looked as if the edges of these timbers had just come out of the shipyard and that not a second had passed over the next 4,500 years.
Archaeologists can investigate ancient boat-building technology as if they were there at its construction 45 centuries ago. Each of the hull's 1,200 pieces was carved by hand.
You have this very complex interlocking jigsaw of the planks themselves. Each piece fit individually and particularly into the piece that was above it, below it, to the ends of it.
But it is how these pieces are joined that is remarkable.
The Egyptians did not use nails or anything to construct the boats.
No screws, no rivets, no glue. This boat is held together by grass. The grass is called halfa, and it's common all over Egypt.
They're these long strands of grass which are very rough, but you rub them together in a particular way, and it forms a very strong yet flexible rope.
Restorers have created a model of the boat at 1 to 100 scale.
This is how they used the ropes to construct the joins pieces in the boat. Incredible.
The development of this technique offered the Egyptians an advantage over other cultures.
At the time that the Khufu ship was built, most other places that we know about were only making dugout canoes out of logs.
This own plank technology meant the Egyptians could build much larger vessels than other rival cultures. They could carry greater loads, travel greater distances. They could trade throughout the known world.
The Egyptians didn't just paddle back and forth on the Nile. They were also fully capable of sailing out into the Mediterranean, places they wanted to go.
This was the basis of tremendous economic success. It laid the foundation for 3,000 years of civilization. It helped create one of the most successful superpowers that the world has ever seen. The Khufu boat is the first of Egypt's 10 greatest discoveries, because boats sparked the birth of an empire. Wealth brought by supersized boats paid for supersized construction. Egypt built temples and monuments on a scale not matched in antiquity. But these temples and monuments could never have been built if the ancient Egyptians had not mastered the skills needed to quarry stone in vast quantities.
All right, so what I want you to document in your notes about Pharaoh Khufu is that he is the first Old Kingdom pharaoh that we're going to talk about. The Old Kingdom lasted from 2686 BC to 2181 BC. Khufu only ruled for about 23 years of that in the 4th dynasty. He had massive building projects using Egypt's resources to do so. One of his major projects was building his tomb, which is the largest pyramid in Giza. His pyramid took over 100,000 people to build, and he had high taxes to pay for his projects, including taxing for food and clothing. People began to revolt during his reign, and it led to some civil war in Egypt during this time. He also built a large ship that he buried close to his tomb, for his use in the afterlife. He was believed he was going to join with the sun god Ra and travel across the sky. So that's all about Khufu. Our next pharaoh is Pharaoh Ahmose. So I'm going to pull up this video on the Hyksos invasion.
The power of the pharaohs declined about 2180 BC, marking the end of the Old Kingdom. Strong pharaohs regained control during the Middle Kingdom, which lasted between 2040 BC and 1640 BC. And during this period, law and order was restored. They improved trade and transportation. They dug a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. They built huge dams to trap and channel the Nile floodwaters for irrigation. They also created thousands of new acres of farmland by draining the swamps of Lower Egypt. The prosperity of the Middle Kingdom did not last, however. In about 1640 BC, a group from the area of present-day Israel moved across the Isthmus of Suez into Egypt. These people were called the Hyksos, which means the rulers of foreign lands. And the Hyksos ultimately ruled much of Egypt from 1630 to 1523. We will continue our study of Egypt in the next few chapters and go in depth, picking up with the Hyksos and also looking at the various pharaohs that ruled in Egypt.
All right, so Ahmose is our first Middle Kingdom pharaoh, and the only Middle Kingdom pharaoh we're going to talk about. The Middle Kingdom lasted from 2074 BC to 1759 BC. I'm going to see if I can, okay, there we go. Couldn't see all of it. That's the, so 2074 BC to 1759 BC is the Middle Kingdom pharaohs' dates. Ahmose rules for approximately 30 years of it. Now, during the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians increased their trade, they built better irrigation systems, and it was a very prosperous time for Egypt. However, in the middle of this Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos people infiltrate the Nile Delta area, and they eventually overtook Lower Egypt for 100 years. Part of the reason that the Hyksos people were able to do this is because they had better weaponry and really good military tactics. What I mean by that is they were using bronze weapons. So the Hyksos people had chariots, they had bronze armor, and they had more advanced weapons. The Egyptians are fighting nearly naked, and they're still using copper weapons like javelins. So the Hyksos people were able to overtake them. Side note, the Hyksos people are also thought to be Canaanite descendants. Now, the Hyksos people last for about 100 years. And then this pharaoh almost takes the throne and is able to lead the Egyptians to a victory against the Hyksos people. He challenges the Hyksos and he begins driving the Hyksos out of the land and defeats them. He then rules for about 30 years. Another reason the Egyptians were eventually able to defeat the Hyksos people is because they started to pick up on the bronze weaponry and develop those bronze weapons as well. And we call this the beginning of the Bronze Age. Bronze, in case you are not aware, is the smelting of copper and tin into one metal. So it's stronger than just a copper weapon alone. It's a stronger metal. All right. Moving on to our New Kingdom pharaohs. We have King Tut, Queen Hatshepsut. It's a hard name to say. And Ramses the Great. King Tut is most known and probably everyone's favorite.
The boy king Tutankhamun is perhaps the most recognizable Egyptian ruler of all time, though he only ruled Egypt for 10 years.
He's famous because by chance we have an intact tomb of a pharaoh. And even though it's a minor one, it gives us a glimpse into the real splendor and wealth of ancient Egypt.
Born Tutankhamun around 1341 BC, it is believed that his father was King Akhenaten.
His mother is still unknown because the DNA testing doesn't allow you to differentiate between a bunch of different sisters. The Egyptians made things very tough on historians by a lot of times marrying their siblings.
Tutankhamun assumed the throne at 9 years old.
Try to imagine a fourth grader as mayor of your town. The chances of a child running the country are really slim or non-existent. Other people were calling the shots.
Akhenaten had taken the country through a religious change, and Tut spent most of his reign revoking his father's religious reforms, even changing his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun.
I think what you could say King Tut's most important act was more as a tool for powerful interests who wanted to overturn much of what his father did. To try to overturn the dictates of a former pharaoh, the best tool in your arsenal is to have the new pharaoh to do that with.
After 10 short years as pharaoh, Tutankhamun died at the age of 19.
No one knows what killed King Tut, and he died as a relatively young man, but there were a lot of things in the ancient world that could cause your death. He was infected with malaria, DNA testing shows. He had a lot of bones that had been broken, including some relatively close to the time he died. Infection is not unheard of. Assassination is not unheard of.
Tutankhamun was largely forgotten until 1922, when archaeologist Howard Carter found his tomb.
He suddenly went from being an absolute unknown to being perhaps the best known, all because of this discovery that took everyone by surprise. Such fabulous wealth. Nothing like that had been discovered before, and nothing really since.
All right. What I want you to document in your notes for King Tut is that he is a New Kingdom pharaoh. The New Kingdom lasted from 1500 BC to 1000 BC, but Tut only reigned for 10 of those years. He took the throne at 9 years old and died at 19 years old. We do know that he was born in 1341 BC. He is buried in the Valley of the Kings, but his tomb was significantly smaller. It's believed that this tomb was initially built for a nobleman, and because King Tut died so suddenly, it was used as his burial ground. The benefit is that his tomb was found untouched in 1922, with many treasures and artifacts, more than any other pharaoh had been found buried with. We don't know who his mother was, probably because his father married a sister, which makes DNA testing really difficult. We do know that King Tut married his own half-sister. He also reestablished polytheistic culture in Egypt. His dad had tried to move to a monotheistic Egypt, probably to reduce the influence of the priests during the New Kingdom era. The New Kingdom priests had gained a lot of influence and power during the New Kingdom, and so King Tut's dad probably was trying to diminish that by moving to a monotheistic culture. But King Tut reestablished their polytheistic culture. There are several possible causes of death. We're not really sure how King Tut died, but he did test positive for malaria. It's also possible that he had infections. He definitely had broken bones. His skeleton was found to have broken bones, and it's always possible that he was murdered. So, all of these are possible causes of his death. Queen Hatshepsut is our next pharaoh. She's also a New Kingdom pharaoh. Really briefly, I'm going to show you this. This is a really funny video. If you pay attention, the man in it cracks me up. See if I can. It's really quiet, so you might have to turn up the volume on your computer.
Egypt's top official for antiquities announced intriguing new details to identify the once-lost mummy of Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's great queens. The clue, a tooth found among the queen's belongings. Zahi Hawass says the tooth matches a gap in the mouth of a mummy believed to be royal, found in a tomb known as KV-60.
It is identified with the person, and therefore that tooth exactly fits with the mummy that we found in KV-60. This lady was fat. She died at the age of 50. She had diabetes, and she died because of cancer.
While Hawass believes the identification is virtually certain, DNA testing is needed to prove the identity conclusively. Hatshepsut was one of the most famous female figures of ancient Egypt. Her husband, the Pharaoh Thutmose II, was also her half-brother. When he died, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt on behalf of her stepson, Thutmose III. Until her reign, only a handful of women had ruled Egypt, but none had attained the status of pharaoh. Hatshepsut slowly took on the regalia and symbols of the pharaoh. But this masculine office required a radical image change. She began to be depicted in male form, wearing a traditional kilt, headcloth, and even a false beard. As the clearly dominant co-ruler of Egypt, Hatshepsut's reign has been characterized as peaceful. She defended Egypt's borders, initiated a lucrative trade expedition to the land of Punt, and remodeled the great temple complex of Karnak. Her greatest achievement was perhaps the sprawling Deir el-Bahri, a funerary monument in her own memory, dedicated to the sun god Amun-Re. In the wake of her death, Hatshepsut's legacy was concealed as subsequent rulers demolished statues and tried to erase her from the historical records. And while Egyptologists of the modern era have been able to piece her story together, the most tangible asset, her mummy, was missing. Now, the discovery of her mummy has provided the final piece in bringing this pharaoh's legacy back to life.
Alright, so that's Queen Hatshepsut. What I want you to note is that she is a New Kingdom pharaoh. She is the first female to rule. She did live to be 50 years old, which is pretty substantial. And an average lifespan was about 40, and rule lasted for about 1 to 2 decades. She died of cancer. She did take over when her husband, Thutmose II, died. Her son, Thutmose III, was less than 10 years old when she came to rule. And I know you're thinking, how did she come to rule? King Tut was able to rule at 9. Why couldn't Thutmose III rule at 9? Probably because Queen Hatshepsut had the support of the priests and the army when she came to rule. But she is, by all records, considered to have been a really great Egyptian pharaoh. She extended Egypt's trade outside of the borders and protected Egypt with a military. While most Egyptians were more concerned with, most pharaohs in the New Kingdom were more concerned with expanding Egypt and its empire, creating an empire. She was just concerned with preserving what Egypt had. She built obelisks and tall monuments to the sun god with her images on it. You should also note that in these images, she dressed as a man to gain respect. So a lot of the a lot of the images that we have of her and sculptures that we have of her, she is depicted as a man. She had a 20-year rule, and it was a very peaceful time. She made trade agreements instead of going to war. After her, when Thutmose III does rise to power, he tries to erase her from history by destroying temples, images of her. He isn't successful, obviously, in destroying everything, because we still found artifacts of hers and sculptures and paintings of her. But he does do a good job of attempting to erase her from history. We don't know why he hates her. That's up for speculation. It's possible because her rule lasted so long that he hated her because she trumped over his rule for such a long time. Maybe it was mutual hate. Nobody's really sure. That's all up for debate. But her stepson, Thutmose III, did hate her and try to erase her from history. All right. Our last pharaoh is Ramses the Great. And he does live up to that name.
Ramesses II, commonly referred to as Ramesses the Great, or the Great Ancestor, was the third Egyptian pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. Ramesses II is celebrated as one of the greatest pharaohs in ancient Egyptian history. Ramesses II ascended to the throne in his late teens after his father's death. He was engaged in several military campaigns early in his reign in an effort to retrieve territories held by the Nubians and the Hittites. After defeating Sheridan sea pirates in a naval battle near the mouth of the River Nile, Ramesses II launched his first campaign into Canaan. By the 4th year of his reign, Ramesses captured the Hittite vassal state of Amurru. The following year, Ramesses II sought to expand Egypt's frontiers into modern-day Syria at the Battle of Kadesh. He ordered tens of thousands of soldiers to modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, which then belonged to a more substantial enemy than he had ever faced, the Hittite Empire. The Egyptian armies were ambushed and outnumbered at Kadesh, but the pharaoh and his armies stalemated the army and returned home as heroes. Ramesses II decorated many monuments with inscriptions describing the campaign and battle as an unprecedented victory. A few years later he returned in a third Syrian campaign. Ramesses II split his army into two forces. He led one force into Jerusalem and Jericho, and the second force was led by his firstborn son, Amun-her-Kepesheth, the son of Ramesses' first wife, Nefertari. By the 10th year of his reign he returned to Hittite territory once again and laid siege to towns in Retanu and Tunip in Naharin. Neither side could decisively defeat the other in battle, eventually leading to a proposed peace treaty with the Hittite king of Kadesh, Hattusili III. The peace treaty between the Egyptian and Hittite empires was recorded both in Egyptian hieroglyphics and Akkadian, in cuneiform script. Together they make up the oldest peace treaty in world history. He restored traditional Egyptian religious culture, before Amenhotep IV changed it into something closer to a monotheistic religion, where the sun god Aten was worshipped over all other gods. After reigning for 30 years, Ramesses II celebrated a jubilee called the Sed Festival and was ritually transformed into a god. He had brought peace, solidified Egyptian borders, and built many monuments across his empire. Ramesses II had made Egypt rich during his 66-year reign, and by the time of his death, aged around 90 years, he had outlived many of his wives and supposed 100 sons and daughters. Ramesses II was originally buried in the Valley of the Kings, but was moved several times and is located today in Cairo's Egyptian Museum.
All right. What I want you to document is Ramses the Great is a New Kingdom pharaoh. He's in the 19th dynasty. He was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. He became pharaoh as a teenager, and he lived to be 90 years old, which is, once again, a substantial life during this time. He rules for 66 years, and during that time he fought many battles and established the oldest peace treaty. It's approximated that he had 100 sons and 60 daughters. It's a lot of children. He built monuments to himself to display his greatness, but in all fairness, he is known as the greatest pharaoh. He took Egypt to the height of its power, expanding the empire. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, and in the Jubilee ceremony that he had during the 30th year of his reign, the priests declared him a god. So, That's the last of our pharaohs. You have 6 pharaohs to know. They will show up on your Ancient Egypt test. If you have any questions, myself, Miss Anderson, and Miss Wills would be more than happy to clear up any questions that you have. Please make sure that you have all of these notes written down. I will be checking them for a grade. Thank you.